Welcome, everybody. It's me, James Leichter. Thanks for coming to another training session. Let's talk about support agreements, service agreements. There are lots of ways to handle service agreements. There's ways to manage the money. There's lots of business decisions that need to be made that are beyond the scope of tech support at Aptora. Now, if you were to Google my name, service agreements, you'll find that I've written and published a lot on the topic. There are dozens of articles that I've written out there. If you just simply Google my name, service agreements, then you should find lots of advice on pricing, selling, how they improve your company's morale, cash flow, how they increase the value of your business, and also how you can go broke selling service agreements. I will teach you how to go bankrupt selling service agreements. Really, actually, what I'm talking about is how service agreements can cause companies to lose a lot of money if they're not done properly. But as far as I'm concerned, service agreements are absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. It's one of the handful of things that you absolutely should prioritize. With that in mind, let's talk about them. To get started with a service agreement, you first have to create service agreements to sell. We might open up our invoice items list. Now, I've created a filter under global filters called service agreements. And if I click it, I'm able to see my service agreements. If you're not using these filters, please do. They're fantastic. You simply go down here, click new filter, give it a name, set your parameters. You'll love them. So here I have multiple service agreements. We create a service agreement by creating a new item. Now, the first 10 minutes of this webinar are going to cover the most confusing thing about service agreements. To create a service agreement, you select service agreement type here, and you should give it a category. I'll skip that for now. So the first thing you're doing is creating something to sell to people. This is not a service agreement that you're creating for the customer. That's the confusing part, is it's a two-step process. We have to have something to sell first. Then we put this on an invoice and we actually fill out the paperwork, the service agreement. So let's talk about the paper version of all this. Before you got software to do it for you, back when I got started, I carried an aluminum forms holder. And you open up that aluminum folder, and inside there we had invoices. And I filled out the invoice for the service call. And then I might have said to you, would you be interested in investing in one of our safety and efficiency agreements, a service agreement? And if they bought one, I filled out the service agreement form. I wrote on the invoice, service agreement $199, whatever the price was, whatever the item number was. So I put the service agreement on the invoice, a paper version of one of these, right? And then I filled out the service agreement, and it had the model number, serial number, and so forth on it. So what we're doing is we're first creating something to sell. And let's look at one that's been created. Here, I have a service agreement that I call SEAR ES3. That stands for Safety and Efficiency Agreement Residential 3-Visit. And I give the whole thing a description right here. I establish a price that can later be edited. I establish a default discount that can be changed later. And then I decide on the number of visits and the term in months. Now, if you sell a service agreement that lasts 1 year and then it expires, obviously we're going to put in 12 months. What if you sell a service agreement that goes on every month in perpetuity and the customer has to cancel? You still have to give it a term, and you might decide 1 year, 36 months, 100 months. You can always extend that number later, and I'll show you how. But you do have to enter something. It's a required field. Regardless of how many pieces of equipment this service agreement covers, you should have one agreement for one or more pieces of equipment. You would just change the price accordingly. So it may be $199 for one system, and then it might be another $99 for each additional system at the same address. But we recommend that you have one service agreement no matter how many pieces of equipment, but you will have to have different service agreements depending on how many visits you're offering and possibly the term. You want to give the service agreement a description here which describes the actual service agreement to the reader, and you give it a description that describes what the customer's getting. This is what the customer will read. And if you give them a discount for owning a service agreement, the software is going to create a discount item automatically. And this is the description that you will give them. So that's the description that'll show up on the discount item, and you'll see that in a minute. Finally, on this tab, we have one more thing to consider: labor minutes. How many labor minutes do you think it'll take to do this work? It's an option. You'll notice when I hover over certain things, a tooltip, as it's called, pops up. Now, you may say to yourself, how will I know how long this is going to take? It's your best guess. It isn't used for accounting purposes. It's just FYI. It's used for different things in the software that we won't really get into today. It's not critical. Now, again, you can create as many of these as you want. We do have clients that create a service agreement for 2 pieces of equipment, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10. That's fine. The software is very flexible, but we typically don't recommend that. But you certainly could. Just be sure to describe what you get and don't get in these fields. Let's look at the accounting tab. Here you select income account that's tracking your income. You select your cost of goods sold account. Now, the COGS account isn't used very often in the software because you're not actually buying a service agreement. But you should pick a COGS account in case it is needed. But remember, you're typically not buying a service agreement from anybody. You could possibly buy one from a third party, but it's unlikely. You're providing these with your own technicians. Here you have a tax code, just like these things are just like you've seen on other inventory items, on any other invoice item. Here's what you haven't seen if you haven't dealt with service agreements. You have an escrow holding account, and you have an escrow method. If you don't see those, then we should visit preferences and talk about those. Under company preferences, there is a escrow accounting option. With it turned on, you will see these 2 features. as long as we're in here, let's be sure we cover these real quick. Allow duplicate service agreements. Generally, we don't recommend that. What that should actually say is allow duplicate service agreement numbers. That would be a better description. The tooltip mentions that. Automatically add service agreement discount. That probably is a good idea. When you create an invoice, it will automatically add the service agreement discount to the invoice or work order. Disable automatic service agreement numbering. The software numbers the service agreements automatically. It's probably a good idea to leave that unchecked. Do not include vendors in the sold by selection. If you hover over that, you can see what that means. If you don't have 1099 salespeople, which are technically a vendor, then you probably don't want your vendors showing up in your sales rep field. So you would probably say, yeah, don't include that. Service agreement batch renewals should. Now we're going to talk about the batch renewal feature in a moment. We have two options. The batch service agreement renewal should create a new service agreement or extend the dates on an existing service agreement. Think back the paper method. When a customer says, I would like to renew my service agreement, if you pulled out their old service agreement and you crossed out the expiration date and wrote in a new date and maybe got them to initial it, then you would probably want to extend the dates on the service agreement. But most of us never do that, right? We typically pull out a new form and we say to them, here's your new form, here's your total investment, please sign here. So generally, you want to create a new service agreement on the expiration date. Another thing to think about is, when do they expire? Do they expire every year and then you have to actively renew them? Or do they go on forever, as we talked about earlier? If they go on forever, the choice isn't so important. But you might say, I want to extend the date of the service agreement. Those are the only preferences. So here we have escrow holding account. With the escrow feature turned on, the software does not recognize income until you do the work. There's another choice I'll tell you about in a second. But the escrow feature is terrific because what it does is it defers the income and allows you to keep up with what accountants call the matching principle, where you're matching income to costs of goods sold and or expenses. And that's a good thing. You want to do that. You don't want to sell a service agreement today, recognize the income today when you haven't done any of the work. Generally, we recommend that the escrow feature be turned on. So an example of tech support versus consulting, tech support would tell you what it means, but never advise you on whether you should use it or not, because that's a business consultant's job or an accountant. Sometimes they're both. You know, accountants can be consultants. Oftentimes, accountants are not good consultants. But that's really not a tech support question. Is, should I use it? What do you think? What account should I pick? They wouldn't tell you that. Now, generally speaking, if you hover over this, it'll say, usually a liability account. This is where money is held until shifted into an income account. So if you were to collect $500 for a service agreement, that $500 goes into the bank and it shows up on your income statement as an asset. So we debit cash on hand, the bank account, and then we need to credit something. So what you might want to do is you might want to create an account to hold that money And then the software will shift that money for you depending on the escrow method. Now there's two options. We only have one option available because this item is in use. And once you use this item, you can't change it. We'll create a new one real quick here so we can see the other option. We have two options. We can match the money with the work orders. So when the work order date arrives, the money will be moved. If the work order is postponed or delayed, that's fine. The money only moves on the date of the work order. By the way, it moves whether the work order is completed or not. So the movement gets created behind the scenes now. When you sell the service agreement, the movements are created behind the scenes instantly. But they are dynamically attached to the work order so that if the work order dates change, so will the movements. Or you could create monthly movements where we take the money and divide it by 12. If there's an extra penny, it's put on, I believe, the first month. So that way, you would take $199. In this case, it would take $199.99 and divide it by 12. And those become the movements. And they move every month on the first day of every month. And those are created behind the scenes. Now, let's talk about where those are. If we come down to customers service agreement list, right under service agreement list, with the preference turned on, this menu will show up. Service agreement escrow movement. These are all the movements that are created. Now keep in mind, many of these could be future dated. And if you were to double click on one, you can see it. It is basically an adjusting journal entry. You'll notice, though, some of the fields are not editable. You can edit the date in case you have to fix it. You can edit the memo. You can edit the department. That's it. And we did that by design because we don't want this getting messed up. So that's where you can find your movements. And why would you want to look at them? You might have to fix something. You might have done something you didn't want to do, and you need to deal with it. If you right-click, you'll notice that you can also delete them. Just be real careful. Be careful deleting them. If you do delete them, you can't bring that escrow movement back. You can't bring it back. What you would have to do is you would have to enter a journal entry if you wanted to put it back. And the journal entry would do the same thing to your accounting. You'll notice that the accounts are picked right here. So an adjusting journal entry will do the same thing, but you cannot create a new movement in this list. That option's not available. All right. If you have questions, make a note of them. Just think about your question, jot it down so I can hit them all at once. The rest of the fields on this form are the same as if you were dealing with most other things, like an inventory part. So I won't get into the various other things on this form because they're not specific to service agreements. I do want to remind you about your notes feature. This is where you can add notes about the service agreement. So you might want to put in notes here about what you will do, what you won't do, notes for the technician, etc. The customer generally won't see these. So these are for internal purposes. You might also want to add documents to this item. This is where you might add your 33-point precision tune-up professional cleaning checklist. So you can add as many documents as you'd like. If you are a mobile user, those might be very handy because you could go into the document link and open it, and you'll have your checklist. You might also want to have a checklist built in Aptora Mobile Form Builder where you could build a checklist and fill it out from your mobile device. If you don't own Aptora Mobile Form Builder, it is an add-on to mobile, and it does come free with our hosting plan, but you might want to look into that. I won't be getting into mobile at all because there's enough to do here. Let's close those and let's create an invoice. So we had an opportunity to sell one. We're going to find a customer, and I'm going to find me. I'm in here. There I am. And those are notes popping up that are related to the customer. Maybe the dog bites, don't let the cat out. I'm over my credit limit. I have past due invoices. This is the story of my life. All right, so here I am. Now, the diagnostic fee was added automatically. As you might know, that happens to be a feature in the software. And I'll just type in a date and a sales rep has been selected because I have a default. The purchase order, that's the customer's PO, and maybe it was James. He said he would do it. He said he'd buy it. Now we need to add this service agreement to the invoice. Maybe we went out on a service call and we said, hey, I notice you don't own one of our safety and efficiency agreements. Your total investment is just $199. And if you were to invest in one today, I will waive the repair fee because it was a minor thing that was pretty easy for me to deal with, and my boss will allow me to waive it if you owned a service agreement. So what I can do is I can have you invest in a service agreement today. We'll just pretend like you've already had it, and I'll waive the repair charge today. So notice how I use fee and charge to my advantage. And they say, whoa, that's great. I'll do it. And we sell it. Now, when you open up the list, you'll notice that some of these are highlighted, some aren't. The highlighted rows are the ones you probably need to pick. They're highlighted to tell you their service and not the discount. Let's say we sell them a 3-visit service agreement, and we'll make today the first visit, and we'll come back in 6 months and do the second visit, and come back in 6 months and do the third visit. And now we're ready to renew it, unless it's perpetual. That's why we have a 3-visit, so we can sell a 3-visit today and then waive the cleaning fee. So here's my 3-visit that I have on here. And I'm going to collect the diagnostic fee, but that's up to you. That's your company's policy, right? And I might put converted demand service to SEA sale. So we went there on a demand service. We converted them to an SEA sale. So that's it. We're ready to finalize the invoice. Now in the field, we probably would collect money, should. So we'd have a little more to do, but we're just going to call it good for now and hit save and close. Now it tells me they already have a service agreement. I pick somebody with a service agreement. Generally, you wouldn't see this, right? It also tells me they have reimbursable items. We'll ignore that for now. That's another feature for a different webinar. This customer you've selected has item reservations pending. That's a preference to a feature for another webinar. And then finally, it says to me, you sold a service agreement. You now need to do the paperwork. So remember earlier we were talking about pulling out an invoice and a pen and filling it out and then saying, hey, would you like to invest in a service agreement? I sure would. And then we pulled out another form and filled out the paper agreement. Well, the computer, the software is simply telling us that's what you need to do. You need to fill out the paperwork. It also is telling us about the other service agreements that they have owned or currently have in effect. You probably won't see this. I'm in a demo database and I use this person myself in here all the time. Normally you'd click OK and you probably wouldn't see this. But if you do, what it's doing is it's showing you expired service agreements that you can renew. You can hit Edit SA and you can renew an existing service agreement. I generally don't like to do that because it makes it harder to calculate my renewal rate. But you could pick one and edit it. Or you would click New SA. Typically, that's what I'd recommend. You see why tech support explains features and functionality and where to find them, but not which one to pick, how to pick it, because they own those decisions, and those decisions have to be based on lots of experience, knowledge, know-how, asking you questions, understanding your company. So they'll just tell you what button does what. Hit New SA. Pop-up note on the service agreement. That's a preference. I'm getting the same warnings when the service agreement comes up, and here it is. Now, what it did is it filled out most of it for us. Service agreement number is up here. It's editable. The status is pending. The status is pending because we're not within the date range here. Otherwise, the status would typically be active or it could be expired. Depends on the date range. But pending just means that we haven't got to that date range yet. If we're past the date range, it would say expired. The type of service agreement, it can be changed, but typically you wouldn't do that. But you could change it. And what are these? Well, those are the service agreements that we just created or that we talked about creating. If we go to the invoice items list and filter by service agreements, that is the same list that you're seeing here. It filled it out for you because that's the type that you sold, but you could switch it here. You generally would not. Sold by, it grabbed the sales rep from the invoice, but you could change that if somebody else is supposed to get credit for this. The bill to work address is read only. You can't change it. That have to be changed elsewhere. The customer department and the customer sales rep will be populated from the customer information when we save it. Projected labor minutes, we saw that earlier when we created the item. It's editable here. So it could be edited. And why would you edit it? It may be because you are extending this to a second or third year. You're adding extra equipment, etc. So you could edit that. If you want to change the term ends, then you need to check this little box to override it. And you might want to do that if the service agreement needs to be prorated or it needs to take effect in the near future and you said, I will go ahead and start it today. Or your company might consider having all of your service agreements expire 2, 3, or 4 times a year. Some companies that we consult with, for example, twice a year, all of their agreements expire. So they might sell a 6-month agreement, they might sell a 2-month agreement. It all depends on when it's going to expire. That way they have 2, 3, or 4 different expiration dates where they send out renewals or they renew them. Planned visits is 3. That's not editable. Terms is not editable because that came from the item setup. If you have 3 visits planned, well, we haven't completed any of them. So completed is 0. Not completed, that's about to say 3 when we save it. In other, generally you won't see anything in other. But what other is, as you can see from the tooltip, those are work orders that are associated with a service agreement but are not designated as a planned maintenance. So in other words, we have other visits that are not related to this service agreement. And we would if we had other service agreements for this customer, which we did, as we know. User-defined fields, I won't get into that because that's just like what you've seen elsewhere. This service agreement is a renewal. If you are renewing a service agreement or you realize you didn't renew it, you created a new one, and you forgot to renew it, you didn't know that you had an option to renew an existing agreement, you can always tell the software, this service agreement is a renewal. So just check that box. Now I have a trick for you that's documented somewhere deep inside the fine print of our help system, I think. If you push Shift Control and double click on this label, a box will pop up, and that will allow you to type in the service agreement number that you are renewing. This is handy, again, when you forgot that you could renew an agreement. And you're finding that you wish you had that data. It looks like you don't renew a lot of service agreements because you've been creating new ones all this time and not doing a renewal. Well, you have the ability to go back and fix those. Just check that box and type in the service agreement number. There is no lookup available here. You'll have to enter that number, and then you will save that prior to moving on. So most of you weren't aware of that. Let's go to menu. First thing we need to do is save it before we go any further. I like to save a lot. So now it tells you the invoice number and the date that this service agreement was sold from, and you can double click that label if you need to look at the invoice. We now know the customers department, the sales rep, those got filled in. We'll click menu. And by the way, not completed is still 0. Notice that. We're about to fix that. We'll click menu. First thing we want to do is select the equipment that the service agreement covers. And I might say that it covers this and it covers that. And here you should have a list of all the equipment this customer owns, whether you sold it to them or not. And you'd pick the things that are covered under the service agreement, like the condensing unit, the furnace, the evaporator coil, the water heater. Is the thermostat covered? Then you might put the thermostat in the customer's equipment. Why would you want to do that? Well, thermostats used to be so cheap, I never thought of them as equipment, but now they get expensive and they have serial numbers. So I like to put them in as customer equipment for better tracking purposes. So now we have our equipment selected. We have a copy feature, by the way, if you are doing a bunch of these without an invoice, like you're playing catch up. If you're new to Total Office Manager and you're just putting in these service agreements by hand, You can copy this to make it easier on you. If you want to renew an existing service agreement, you would click this option and it will create a copy, but the copy will be renewing the agreement that it spawned from. Creates an exact copy and it checks that box for you. That box becomes uneditable. Down here, it's checked for you and it knows it's a renewal. So this is a place where you can do a renewal too. Typically, you would do this from an invoice. You would go to the invoice and sell them another service agreement, and you would hit the renew option that we saw earlier from the invoice. This is if you have to play catch up. We add notes just like we would add notes all over the place. You can put in notes here, like for example, what's covered, special circumstances, etc. We don't really have any history yet. We haven't done anything with this service agreement. But this would show you the escrow movements, work orders, estimates, sales that the service agreement is related to. It doesn't show you the original sale. It shows you every sale after that where the customer received their precision tune-up or service calls covered under the service agreement. Finally, we come down to create. This, by the way, is just shortcuts. Create. As an option, you can create things from this service agreement, such as an invoice, a sale, a credit, an estimate, or start adding equipment, because maybe you had no equipment to select. But what I want to show you and focus on is not a one-time work order. I want to create the planned maintenance work orders. This form is where the software will automatically create the 3 work orders. Now remember, in the scenario I talked about earlier, I pretended as if we did our first tune-up already. I'm going to cover that. So we went to their home, said, oh, this would have been free if you owned a service agreement. We sold them a 3-visit agreement. We made today's visit the first precision tune-up and professional cleaning. The service agreement at this point doesn't know about that, so it's going to make us 3. We decide on the priority, the work order type. Here it might be preventative maintenance. It might be service agreement. It just depends on what you want to do. The description, remember, these are forward-looking work orders. They're going to be dated in the future. How do you want to describe the work order? What's the general description, the brief description as we call it? And it might be precision tune-up, professional cleaning, under, and that's enough typically, under an SEA. And that may be enough. And who's the tech? Well, maybe we don't know. So we can leave it blank. And what department is it? Well, it's suggesting the demand service department because that's the department that came over from the customer. But in this case, it really doesn't belong to that department. It belongs to maintenance. So I would look at my residential HVAC department, and yours are going to look different, but this is our recommendation. I'll look here, residential HVAC, demand service, maintenance. That's the one I want. That will be the department on the work order. If we had added notes to the service agreement, and earlier we looked at the menu and saw notes, if we typed in notes there, we had the option of copying those notes into each work order. Now, this little label down here kind of gives it away. You could just read this and I could stop talking. That gives it away your next step. So if you forget, just read that. But what you're going to do is you're going to click Auto, and it created for us 3 work orders. It really doesn't know how to date them, so it takes its best guess. The first work order was dated the same as the invoice, and that was a good guess because we performed our first precision tune-up under this scenario that I've drawn for you. We performed our first one, so that's a good guess. The second and third, maybe that's a good guess. I don't know. We can leave those alone, or we can change those dates because it might be 6 months from now, and it might be 6 months after that. But I do know one thing. The first one is completed, so I have an option to complete it right there. So it's going to create the work order for me and mark it as completed, and that's good because now we have a record of it. We have a work order that represents the work that we did when we went out there. Now, we still might have the original work order for the demand service. In addition to that, another work order gets created and it's marked as completed. That's important because now the software will tell you you've completed 1 out of 3, you have 2 left. So we'll mark that as completed. And now we're ready to say, okay, because we're done here. Created plan maintenance. Would you like to automatically add a discount item to the work orders? Yes, I would. 3 have been created. At that point, this form will open up, and it just gives you another chance to see what you've created. And if you realize that you want to do something else, you can always change them. Like, for example, you might want to assign different technicians, and you were only offered the opportunity to select 1 for all of these. Now you can double-click to open them and change them around. Now, if you're curious, where do these go? Well, they show up in your work order list, and they also show up on your schedule board as unscheduled work orders. Their unscheduled status is shown right here. Remember what defines that status. A work order is unscheduled when you don't have a date, a time, or a technician. You have to have all 3 of those things. So we'll close that. Now, one thing I forgot to show you earlier, when we went into the planned maintenance form, it showed us the escrow movements. We saw the dates of the movements, and they're following the dates of the work order. If I were to go modify the work order dates, it modifies those movements. And I also noticed it added the penny at the end. I said earlier it was at the beginning or the end. It put the extra penny on the last movement. And we get calls on that. We have people say, where does that money go? Where's that penny go? So that's on the last movement. And we should see those movements now here. So we have new movements. James liked her right there. And if we open it, there's the movement. And remember, the date is determined by the work order. We change the work order, it changes the date. You can also change it here if you have to. Generally, you would not get in here unless you're fixing things. So the average user shouldn't be given permission here to get into this. Only your accounting people should be getting into that. You can really mess things up. That's it. So the service agreement was completed. The work orders are done. And that is about all there is to it. A couple points to remember is it's important to departmentalize your company. You really want to have departments set up. In my case, I have a division called residential HVAC, and I have maintenance here. And maintenance is my service agreements. Everything else for service work anyway is called demand service, meaning they called and demanded it. I have no heat. I want somebody to come out here and clean my system. So I have demand service, which is your typical service call, and then I have maintenance, and that's work we do on a regular basis under the service agreement coverage. Now, let's take a look at a few other things. Let's go to Menu, Customers, and remember, we have lots of shortcuts. We have a strict 3-mouse click rule. Let's go into the customer's history. And let's go to Service Agreements. There they are. The service agreement we created today is in here. It's pending because we haven't got to those dates yet. And we can open that up just by double-clicking, but of course it's already here. Once we're in here, we can go look at the equipment that was selected. You can go to your Equipment tab and you can double-click on a piece of equipment. Go to Menu, go to History for that equipment, and you'll be able to see the service agreement that covers that equipment. And there it is. And you'll be able to see all the work orders for that piece of equipment, service agreement or not. And you'll be able to see all the invoices for that piece of equipment, including the invoice that sold the service agreement. You'll be able to see all of those there. Another thing I want to point out is the work order list. Let's do show all real quick. All right, so we got a lot of work orders here. In your company, you could have hundreds of thousands of work orders. We have plenty of clients that are approaching 1 million work orders. You need a good way to sort them out. You can go to the quick filter and use it, and that's typically good enough. But remember, you can also just come in here and just say, look, show me not completed, and get rid of a lot of them. And then you could create a global filter. If you search for the same thing on a frequent basis, create a global filter such as preventative maintenance. And then you can see PTPC as part of an SEA. You can see that I've got those here. And I can filter further using the quick filter. What I'm getting at is if you want to go find those 3 work orders that we just created, it's easy to do that. And if you want to keep your eye on work orders under service agreements, it's easy to go in and create filters for that. Let's open up a work order that we created and talk about a couple things specific to selling service agreements. The General tab shows us that brief description that we entered. Nothing's been entered into the details. It wasn't assigned to anybody, etc. Under Notes, we automatically entered created from service agreement number 216. Just FYI, just so the tech knows it. There's other ways for the tech to know it, but we put that in there probably because somebody wanted it there years ago. There's a box checked here, planned maintenance. That tells you that this is part of a service agreement. So we know that this is part of a service agreement, this work order. What department? Maintenance. Over at the Equipment tab, we see the equipment that's covered. And nothing else is really any different. This stuff here does what it does, service agreement or not. Maybe with the exception of the software said Do you want me to add that discount automatically? Yes, I said, and it put it in there. Now, this work order, I just noticed, isn't the one we created earlier. It's a different one, but I noticed because the item is not the same one, Res 2 versus Res 3. But that's what it does. It puts the discount in there. And that's the difference between a work order created by hand, perhaps, and a work order that was created as part of planned maintenance service agreement sale. Service agreement, yes, is all over the software. You'll see that in most places, and you also have the ability to make sure that that's a column in your work order list. These columns here are available by just checking the box, and you might find these very handy because all of those can be filtered on, searched on, etc. Like callback, is it a callback? Who is the callback on? Do they have service agreements? Yes or no? Is an invoice, has it been invoiced? Yes or no? Has the work order been invoiced? Yes or no? Does it even require an invoice? Let's go look at that. We open up a work order, and one option is no invoice or sale is required. When you check that box, the software is satisfied that you don't need to create an invoice for this work order. So that not only tells the user you don't need to create an invoice for this work order, but it also tells the software that it isn't needed. And that answer could be a column. You could add that column just by going back to that show columns preference list, and it's in here somewhere, invoiced. Right there. There it is. Now it has a little asterisk next to it telling you that you should keep it unchecked unless you need it, because it'll slow down the performance of the work order list. It has to go figure that out. Anything with an asterisk slows down the list because that's information that the software has to go find or has to calculate. But if you need it, great. Just check the box. And there it is, invoiced. Yes or no? And then we have one for, does it even need an invoice? Now, as a consultant, not a tech support person, because this is consulting, I recommend you always have an invoice, even if it's no charge. If you have to go out and make a repair for free because it's covered under a service agreement, and this is true if it were warranty work or a callback, you should still completely fill out the invoice. And then the service agreement discount will take it down to 0 if it needs to be 0, or take it down by 15%. Bottom line is you should always have an invoice and a work order. Whenever you send service technicians out into the world to do things, they should have a permission slip, we happen to call a work order, and they should have to fill out a report on what they did, and that's called an invoice. Always have a work order, always have an invoice. And with that, you now know how to manage service agreements in Total Office Manager. I will unmute everyone to see if there are any questions. Okay, everybody's unmuted. Did anyone have any questions about service agreements? Nobody. Well, I did a fantastic job then. Hopefully that was helpful. Oh, yes, someone does. Marlena, your mic should be live. Go ahead. Oh, she says she cannot speak. Okay, now you're live.
Can you hear
Hi
me
there.
okay?
I sure do.
Can you hear me okay, James? Okay, good. So the first question was, I get a lot of calls from companies where their technician is out in the field trying to create the, number one, they've already sold the service agreement, so they've already applied it to the invoice, and they want to know if now the technician has the ability to auto-populate. I see it's auto-populated when you click the auto button in Tom, but is that how you do it in the field from the mobile device as well? Is there an auto button for the plant maintenance?
No. So in the mobile app, you don't have the ability to do what I called all the paperwork. You don't have the ability to create the service agreement, to create the planned work orders, etc. The reason why is we never did consider that to be a programming priority, because most companies don't picture a service tech doing clerical bookkeeping work, because they are very expensive. They need to be billing people. They need not to do paperwork. They're not any good at doing anyway. So that's work that is better served for the people in the office. Now, one thing I should point out is, in your invoice list, you should have a filter called mobile invoices. Mm-hmm. We don't create that for you. You create that yourself. And that way you'll be able to see all of the invoices that have been created in the field. You then open that invoice, and when you hit save and close, this gives you a chance to examine it. Is it correct? Is everything good? Nope, the stage wasn't filled out. I got to do that. Now when you hit save and close, it'll ask you if you want to do the paperwork, just like we saw before. But that's work that the office should do, and not technicians that need to be out billing people for their time.
Got it. Okay, and then I had one other question. When the users are trying to track down the money tied to the work order movements, and then maybe the money doesn't move with the movements, because I'm still trying to understand. I know that one user used the transaction by account, and they put, I guess, their income account in there to track the escrow movements. But then I was trying to get an understanding from Kevin. He said that only shows like the side where the money comes out and not the other side. So can you tell me what reports you would recommend if they're trying to track the money that's coming out of these accounts tied to these escrow movements, and also without escrow?
Sure. So that requires a little bit of basic accounting knowledge. So if you think about, go back to your chart of accounts, and you think about what a chart of account does. We have an income account, we have a COGS account, and the question is, well, how do you track the income, and especially how do you track the COGS? Well, what costs of goods sold were there? Did we sell them an air filter? If we sold them an air filter, then we would put the air filter on the invoice. And maybe they don't have to pay for the air filter. It's included. But if the department on the invoice is maintenance or service agreement or whatever, your costs of goods sold will go up the cost of that air filter. And it'll be applied to that particular department. So what cost of goods sold account is it? I don't know. It's whatever you picked when you put in an air filter. And what if you sold them, pardon me?
This is a service agreement question. Oh,
that's
I
right.
understand this part, but this is
No,
still...
you don't.
No?
Okay. No. Now, keep in mind, you're not alone.
Okay.
And I was abrupt to get your attention. You're not alone. Okay. Remember, you sold the service agreement. You're done with that. What does it cost you? Nothing. Hasn't cost you anything yet. You haven't done anything. But when you go out to do the work, you're going to be entering a timesheet. And when you enter a timesheet, you're creating a cost of goods sold, labor. Well, what for? Whatever work order you picked. That work order is associated with that service agreement. You also gave them an air filter. They're free, they're included, but they cost you money. So you put the air filter on the invoice. Even though it had a zero price, it might have, if that's your policy, whatever you put on the invoice to do the service agreement today, that's creating your cost of goods sold. Does that help?
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's common. That's a common question is where are the COGS coming from? And it'd be no different if you sold them a furnace. There aren't any COGS until you actually start buying things and putting in that furnace. So be sure, the key for all of you out there, all of our customers have to understand, it's really important to have a good department list set up. It's really important to have a good set of chart of accounts. It's really important that you track inventory and you don't overuse the non-inventory part, which doesn't create a cost of goods sold. When you do the work, it creates a cost of goods sold immediately, which is not good. So it's really important to have departments, to have a great chart of accounts, and don't abuse the non-inventory part. Use inventory parts as much as possible. And then finally, be sure you're using timesheets.
Don't hear me at work.
Be sure you're using timesheets. That's really important. All right. Any other questions? I see a comment from one of my coworkers. It's a good comment. Utilize the power of the accounting program. That's right. You know, honestly, frankly, you spent a lot of money to get this software. And you need to take advantage of all that power. If you were to open up these menus here, you would count up over 500 forms. Now, certainly some of them are more important than others, but it's really important to take advantage of the software service agreements, equipment, department list, get a good chart of accounts. By the way, if it's time to update your chart of accounts, will tech support help with that? No. Tech support will tell you what a chart of account is, where to find it, but they won't give you any advice. They shouldn't give you any advice on setting it up, fixing yours, cleaning it up, etc. That is a business consultant with accounting knowledge. That is our training department or RA Tax and Accounting. We can help you with that, but we just can't help through tech support. Does anyone have any final questions or comments? All right. Well, I appreciate everybody being here, and I hope now there's a better understanding of service agreements, and please let us know if we can help in any way. We'd be glad to do it. Thank you.